dive right into, all right, if I can get, there we go. If I can get this going. What we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to be talking about trans and non-binary inclusion in youth sports, as I said at the title. I'm going to be talking specifically about some different areas of inclusion. What are different places in our sports teams, our sports organizations, where we can really be inclusive of trans and non-binary athletes, and what types of changes organizations might be able to make. We'll be talking about Ultimate, again, in sort of one way or another, and then Jen will specifically be talking about Bay Area Disc Association's inclusive practices. And a rough sort of schedule, we're gonna have a discussion period, and by discussion, I mean I'm gonna talk at you for a little bit, and then we're gonna have some breakout conversations to sort of discuss what I talked about, and then debrief if there were any questions that came up after the discussion or in the breakout rooms. And then Jen will take over, we'll do a breakout conversation, again, debrief, and a quick closing. So that's our schedule today. Any initial questions, thoughts? No, I think we're good. Cool. So I always like to start with some definitions just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what we are talking about. So the first one that I'm going to start with is non-binary or gender queer. So we're operating here with the idea that gender is non-binary. It's on sort of a spectrum or a sphere or whatever you want to sort of call it. That basically doesn't say that people are men or women. It's more complicated than that. And so there's the handy dandy gender unicorn on the right side, which sort of shows that you can see gender identity can be man, woman, can be other as well, or in the between, and people can fall on different parts of the spectrum. So non-binary or genderqueer are terms that we might use to, as an umbrella term for anybody whose identity falls outside of the classic man, woman, binary. Genderqueer is not as frequently used in media, just sort of broadly now, but it is used a lot when we're talking about youth, because non-binary has sort of become this third box outside of man and woman. And with youth, we really don't want to limit their options. So genderqueer serves as sort of a way to be like, you're, you know, genderqueer, you're not sort of, you don't have to be in a box right now. You don't have to decide what label you have. And that sort of allows more freedom for youth. Genderqueer isn't used as much for adults, but if we're talking about youth and youth sports, genderqueer may come up if we're talking about what does it look like for young people, young athletes to not be, strongly identify one way or another. Related terms, we have transgender and cisgender. These are related terms specifically to each other. And transgender is the idea that someone's sex assigned at birth is not the same as the gender they identify as. So I will just say straight up front that I am a transgender woman. I was assigned male at birth and I identify as a woman. So that is transgender. Cisgender means the sex you were assigned at birth is the same as the gender as you identify, or they're more linked in the classic way we think about it. So if you were assigned female at birth and you identify as a woman, you are cisgender. Transgender is also an umbrella term similar to non-binary. And so they are kind of linked, but not everyone who's non-binary identifies as trans, and not everyone who's trans identifies as non-binary. And those are sort of some of the basic things. For shorthand, we use trans and cis usually as descriptors. Fun fact, this comes from like Latin and chemistry, where trans means across from and cis means on the same side as. So if you think about it that way, it makes sense when we're talking about sex and gender being aligned and transgender being across from or different from. Gender in general is sort of the socially constructed ideas of what it means to be a man or a woman or whatever gender someone identifies as or not. And often we see that expressed through gender expression. So what is on the outside? So on this gender unicorn, we have the little bracket that sort of shows that's like hair and clothing and makeup and what have you, that sort of expresses what your gender is. Gender identity is the more innately held feelings. So in this case, we have the unicorn thinking about the gender identity, but it's more just sort of a core belief and understanding of what someone's gender is. And then in the other way, I already sort of mentioned the sex assigned at birth. This is related to the gender characteristics, outward physical features that medical practitioners generally use at birth to assign a sex, generally male or female or intersex. But it doesn't necessarily align with gender. And it's not just genders, it's not just chromosomes, it's more complicated than that. So that's why we say sex assigned at birth, because we say there is a label that gets put on people at birth, and that's what we call their sex. So those are our definitions. That's what I'm going to be using. That's what Jen's going to be using as sort of our baseline. There are more definitions of more words that are not here, but that sort of gets outside the scope of some of the things that we're talking about. This at least sort of grounds us in terms of who are we talking about? What are their sort of characteristics? What do we mean by gender versus gender expression versus gender identity and those types of things? So I also want to do a quick 101 on trans and non-binary people in sports, again, to just sort of have us all on the same page here. So the first thing, when we're talking about trans and non-binary people in general, there's no one way to be trans or non-binary. There's no one story, there's no one path. And so when we're talking about trans and non-binary athletes, we're talking about in general. Every single athlete, every single person is going to have their own way of experiencing sports and doing and living their experience. And so we have to keep that in mind, that when we're making policy, we want to try to be broad because we don't know what people's experiences are coming in. And when we're talking about what it means to transition, because that word is brought up a lot, obviously, in relation to transgender people, sometimes people think that there's one type of transition. Well, it's actually more complicated. That is, you'll find in most of what we talk about today. There's legal, there's medical, there's social transition. So legal might be doing like a legal name change, for example, or changing your driver's license. Medical could be hormone therapy, for example. And then social is what we often more see with youth when it's about changing what name you use in public, what pronouns you use, maybe how you address the gender expression. That's more of a social transition. And so because every trans and non-binary person has their own story and their own way of doing it, each person does go through their own transition at their own pace in their own way. So again, when we're talking about being inclusive, we have to think, well, not everyone's going to have a legal name change right away. Not everyone's going to have access to hormone therapy. So how do we be inclusive in different ways that doesn't assume that each person's going to be able to check off these different boxes as they go through their transitions in whatever way they look like. Going specifically to sports, one of the points I want to make up front is that trans and non-binary people have no inherent advantages or disadvantages in sports. One thing that often comes up with trans women in particular in sports is an assumption that we, and I say we because again, I am a trans woman who plays sports, have some inherent advantage from being assigned male at birth, and that's not true. People in general are complicated, and there's a wide range of athletic capabilities, and so assuming that because someone is trans or non-binary, that they're inherently going to be better or worse at a sport for some reason is just nonsense. And also we say sports in general because every sport has a different set of skills and attributes that, you know, one aspect might make someone really good in one sport, but really bad in another. And so we don't want to just assume that in general that trans people have, or trans and non-binary people have some inherent advantages or disadvantages, because we don't know. It's more complicated than that. But even though it's complicated, it's not difficult to include trans and non-binary people in sports. There's lots of different ways that we can make policy and practice changes to really be inclusive and allow trans and non-binary people to experience the joys of sports as everyone else does. And in general, trans and non-binary people exist in all sports. There's sometimes a misconception, especially when you talk to like sports administrators, that, oh, my sport doesn't have any trans and non-binary people. I don't need this policy because it won't affect me. And that's just not true, because there are trans and non-binary people everywhere, and they exist in I would say, I can say confidently say they exist in all sports, whether they're out or not, in different ways. And so we want to make inclusive policies and practices so that when those people do decide to come out and share their stories and share their experiences with us, that they feel welcomed in our communities. So those are the definitions. That's the 101. This is what is going to ground our discussion for the next, hour or so, a little bit less than an hour. Okay, so now I'm going to get into sort of the more of the meat of my discussion here. So I'm going to be talking about 6 different areas of inclusion in sports: names and pronouns, using inclusive language in general, registration forms, policy development and implementation, team and organization culture, and community trainings. All of these are related to each other. All of these are also different ways that we can think about being inclusive in sports. The picture to the right is from a Ultimate tournament last summer, when again, we could play Ultimate. That one up in out by Seattle, Washington. So let's talk about names and pronouns first. These are just sort of the main introductory things that we want to make sure that we refer to people correctly. So names are obvious, but if someone changes their name, we want to respect that name change. We would respect someone going from, Caitlin to Kate, for example, or Jennifer to Jen. So why don't we just respect any other name change that people decide to use? And with pronouns, it's interesting because it sort of feels like pronouns are this new thing that's come up, but like everyone has pronouns. We use pronouns to refer to people. So it feels like it should just be a thing that we do on a regular basis. So for example, I didn't do this earlier, but my name is Jenna Weiner. I use she, her, hers pronouns, for example. That's just one example of some pronouns that people might use. There are many different pronouns that people might use. So some examples to the right are she, her, hers, he, him, his. Those are the ones that are most typical. And then they, them, theirs is one that you've probably heard more recently. But there's also some that are less common, but do come up on occasion of, say, sie, hier, hers. And yeah, so you will see different people and hear different people using different pronouns. And it just takes practice to get better at them. I am not great at pronouncing sie, hier, hers, but if I knew people more and used it more frequently, then I would get better at pronouncing it and referring to people using those pronouns. So I want to do just a really quick breakout room, actually, if we can do that, just to get people to get a little practice in using their pronouns. So what I want people to do is just sort of do random breakout rooms and introductions, name, pronouns. You can choose from this list. You can choose any. You can do what you want. And then one thing that you've been doing during the pandemic, one thing that you've been occupying your time with. So for me, I will again give an example. My name is Jenna Weiner. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I have been doing a lot of puzzles to occupy my time during the pandemic. So we'll just do that. We'll have, some reasonably small groups, go around, do some intros. We'll come back in maybe 5 minutes and keep on going.
Welcome back, everyone. I think that's everyone, Jenna. I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Cool. Thanks for engaging me in that, y'all. Hopefully you found it useful to do just a little bit of practice with pronoun sharing and maybe learned a little bit about some of the other folks who are in this call. So cool. I'm gonna jump back to sharing here and okay. I think we should be back and good to go now. Yeah, cool. All right, so that's names and pronouns. Let's talk about inclusive language in general. So inclusive language, having some specific, trying to be inclusive in your language really does set the tone for a welcoming environment and makes people feel like they can belong in that space and participate in it. So one of the things specific to talking about trans and non-binary inclusion is what actually is gender neutral language. So this is a little bit of a tricky topic because sometimes things that we think may be gender neutral may actually not be, at least to the extent that we think. For example, I'm in the Bay Area, I'm from California. People say guys all the time to refer to a group of people. But when we actually talk about people, especially in different groups, we might say guys and girls. Guys is clearly gendered there. So only in the specific cases of you guys does guys ever become really gender neutral. And so I, at least personally, have tried to move away from using guys because I don't need to use it when I can use things like the classic Southern y'all works great for referring to a group of people, or everyone, or folks, also a little bit Southern. Turns out people from the South actually have relatively inclusive language in terms of referring to groups of people, which is kind of fun. So those are at least some of the terms I use. In general, we want to just talk about people as people and not try to specify when we're talking about specifically gendered language in different ways. And inclusive language matters everywhere. So it matters in team interactions, it matters in terms of like registration forms, it matters in all these different places, meetings, presentations. And so we can't neglect it because it doesn't feel appropriate in the space. Inclusive language matters everywhere. And while this presentation is focused on LGBTQ, specifically trans and non-binary inclusion, inclusive language is not limited to LGBTQ inclusion, because we can also think about different words and some of the language that we use that might be racist or sexist or xenophobic in different ways that we might be using without realizing it. And we want to make sure that we're paying attention to what does inclusive language actually mean when we're talking about trying to include all people of all backgrounds and identities. And it's more complicated, and it's, again, something that takes practice to do, to try to work on. It took me a while to go from saying you guys to y'all, and I still occasionally slip up and go back. But it's something that does really make a difference to people, because when you're talking to people, they notice what words you're using and how you're using them in different ways. So I mentioned registration forms briefly. When we're talking about sports in particular, we often have registration forms or interest forms for leagues or for teams or what have you. And sometimes for a new person, that's one of the first things that they see. They want to sign up, say, for an Ultimate Frisbee League in the Bay Area. They're going to go through and click and sign up for a league. And if the form isn't inclusive of their identity, then they might be turned away from that community, from that activity, just simply because they didn't feel like they might be welcomed from simply the registration form. So that's why it has its own slide here, is because it's important as sort of the first line that's people new to sports or new to a sports program might see. So we want to make sure that the forms are inclusive, and we want to think about the categories that we have. So when oftentimes registration forms ask for gender, does your gender have male, female, non-binary, and other? Because generally when we talk about gender versus sex, gender, we talk about men and women, or boys and girls. And for gender, or for sex, we talk about male, female, and intersex. So if you have a form that gender has male and female, well, already, for someone who's paying attention, at least, that doesn't fit right. Or other ones that I've seen are gender is pick one, man, woman, transgender, other. That's also not great because I am a transgender woman. I want to click both of those boxes. So then I have to decide, either I'm going to pick one of them or other, or I'm just going to be like, well, you're clearly not understanding what it means to be inclusive of a transgender woman's experience. I did see one the other day that was like, check all that apply to you. And like, that's a better approach because then you give people more flexibility. Or Jen's favorite is fill in the blank. You're being inclusive. You're not being particularly, you're not showing that you're being inclusive necessarily, but it works to not mess up and allow people to self-identify and then show your inclusivity in other ways. And in general, forms and documentation just need to be consistent. You don't want someone to see one registration form that says one thing and then they sign up for a different league or a different event and it has a different form of documentation. Also things like names. If someone decides to change their name, you want to make sure that someone is able to change their name, change their gender marker in your organization's website or documents in a way that makes them feel welcome. There's nothing worse than struggling for weeks to try to get what should be a simple change in a system fixed because the software like wasn't compatible to changing gender. This is a true tangent of a story, but I tried to, when I was changing my name and gender when I was in grad school at the University of Nevada, Reno, one of the systems that somehow didn't update properly was the like athletics fitness center account, which somehow pulled a bunch of my old information together. And the one field that you could not change was gender. Literally, you could change everything else, but for some reason, they had hard coded in that you could not change gender. And that was so frustrating. Multiple sets of emails talking to different people at different levels in the fitness center being like, why can I not change what should be something that I should be able to change fundamentally? Why can I change everything else except for this one thing? And you don't want people to struggle with it because it sucks. So don't do that. Okay. Speaking of which, if we're making policy, if we're implementing new policies, new programs, new practices, one of the key things, if we want to really be inclusive and welcoming of trans and non-binary athletes and people, is talk to them, work with them to create the policies. For example, Bay Area Disc Association was thinking about updating their policy at some point, and then I was like, hey, we should work together and make a better policy. And they were like, great. And I worked with Jen and the other folks at Bay Area Disc Association, and we made a new, better policy. Obviously, you may not get it right the first time, even if you do work with trans and non-binary athletes. And that's okay, because we learn new things, language changes, policies and practices change every year, basically. And so we won't get it right the first time, but we're gonna try again and again, and eventually, and hopefully we get it closer to right each time. When you're making these policies, it's good to get buy-in from leaders and community members so that they support the policies when they are released publicly. Leaders being coaches or captains or organization leaders in general, and community members as well, because maybe there aren't trans and non-binary athletes in your organization or in your sport who want to step up and work with you. There are probably community members who you can lean on as well and get input from. And once policies are published, receiving feedback and debriefing about, okay, we have this policy, we got some feedback that some things could be better, let's debrief, and then an iterative process. You do it again, and you try again over and over and over again, and hopefully get better each time. It feels like in these policy development implementations that maybe, it's gonna be hard to get to the right thing, but policies do improve, and with a lot of organizations, they have some or none trans inclusion policies. And so we want to make sure that any step forward to including trans and non-binary athletes is a good one. Okay, we're getting there, I promise. Only a couple more. Team and organization culture, this is more in general to sort of like building a culture for a team or an organization. There's a lot of control here that team captains and organization leaders have to sort of say what is and isn't okay. In this case, what is inclusive, what is not inclusive through practices, through specific policies in general. And an inclusive culture in general helps with the other aspects. So if you have an inclusive culture of a team, it's going to be easier to, use inclusive language, to properly use people's names and pronouns, those types of things. And it really is with the team and organization leaders who have real agency here to make change. And going out then to the community, getting the community involved is great, and community trainings in particular, because trainings get everyone on the same page in and out of the organization and the teams. It makes sure that you can discuss new organizational policies and practices, introduce something to the community, be like, hey, we made this new policy, check it out, let us know what you think. It helps make connections between different people in the community, between players and captains and coaches and organizers, to help everyone have better interactions. And ideally, trainings should be recurring on a semi-regular basis, just to make sure that if a policy changes or language changes, that you were able to respond to that. So those are all the 6 big categories that I sort of thought are key to helping sports teams, sports organizations be inclusive of trans and non-binary players. So now I'm going to pause to take any questions that came up right away during the presentation, at least this section so far, and then we'll go into a breakout room discussion with these 4 questions. Were there any terms or concepts you weren't familiar with so far? If so, discuss them in your group. Hopefully someone is more familiar with them. Sort of brainstorm, what does an ideal trans and non-binary inclusion policy look like? This one, hopefully folks will spend a little bit more time on. Like, what aspects of what I've talked about, or what aspects that I haven't talked about are sort of coming up when we're talking about what does it look like to be inclusive of trans and non-binary athletes. If folks are working for specific sports organizations or have a team or a group, how has your team or group or organization tried to include trans and non-binary athletes? If not, why not and how? But if so, what does that look like, even if it is just inclusive language of different types? And are there areas in which your organization, team, group are struggling with inclusion, and sort of where do we go from here in the next steps? So I'm good for now if we're good to go into breakout rooms, or I'm happy to answer some brief questions if some have come up in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for the moment though.
Yeah, Jen and Jenna, sorry. I just wanted to do a quick time check for y'all. It's, I think it's 12:48 Central Time right now. So I just wanted to see how you are feeling in terms of breakout rooms and the rest of the session.
I'm feeling okay. Maybe a 10-minute breakout room chat. Jen, is that fine for you, or am I not leaving any time for you?
No, that's good.
Okay, sounds good. So I will open it up for 10 minutes. And we had a question about sending out those questions. Jenna, could you copy and paste those questions into the chat perhaps?
Yep.
Or if you want to send it to me via email, I can also broadcast it.
Copy and paste will be easy enough, I think.
And meanwhile, while Jenna is doing that, did anyone have any open-ended questions here? Feel free to unmute. We had a question, a real quick question here is, are gender-specific programs mindful of if they have young people transitioning? You can see that in the chat. For instance, folks identifying as female and then transitioning to male.
I would hope gender-specific programs are mindful. Jen can probably speak more to this as someone who's more involved with youth sports than I am directly. But my sort of initial thought would be to just be aware if people want to change teams and what their sort of process in sort of if they're on hormone blockers, which I didn't talk about, but is an aspect that comes up sometimes when we're talking about folks transitioning or as youth or such. Also, when can we go to like 8 minutes?
Sure.
I want to give
Yeah.
Jen a little more time.
Of course, yeah.
7 or 8
open,
minutes, yeah.
I'll go ahead and open them up right now. I think that's everyone. Welcome back. I will hand it back off to Jenna, right?
I'm happy to do an intro, but Jen's gonna take over for this last section here.
Well, there we go. Jen, all yours.
Thanks. I'm gonna share my screen. All right, can everyone see? We're good? Great. Yeah, so I wanted to share with all of you sort of a tangible example of trying or working towards being more inclusive to trans and non-binary athletes. So we had the absolute pleasure of working with Jenna to update our policies and some of our programming, in particular around a high school mixed league that we ran in the fall. And for those who may not know about Ultimate, we have different divisions. Open, which is open to all genders, Women X, which is open to folks who identify as women in a broader term, and then mixed, which is co-ed. And historically in that league, while our intent was to be inclusive and to encourage more girls to play, in actual fact, it sort of forced athletes to choose between man and woman, right? It was only 2 buckets available because of the structure of the league. So we had X number of men on the field and Y number of women on the field, but there was no opportunity to be more inclusive, especially for those athletes who are trans and non-binary. So amazing work and updating all of our policies, we came up with this design question of how might we adapt our existing policies in a meaningful and effective way. And what we ended up doing is making small but meaningful adjustments to our policies and our process. So I wanted to share with you what that looks like, taking something that seemed very structured and being able to adapt it to be more inclusive. So one of the things that we did was, to start right off the bat, is update our high school league policies to have more inclusive language. So instead of having these very sort of like binary descriptive words in there, we updated that to be more inclusive, making sure, of course, that our registration process had like folks on it or y'all or as much as possible. We also worked with the local teams that participated in this league to implement inclusive practices during games. So things like players are welcome to opt in to sharing their gender pronouns, especially in youth. Kids are still figuring themselves out. So we wanted it to be a consent to opt in versus a mandatory you have to share. We also worked with our coaches to sort of memorize hand signals. One of the major concerns was we have these new gender ratios, which I'll talk about in a second. I don't know what to do. How do we make sure that we're not like delaying the game and making it longer? Well, we came up with a very simple solution. Hand signals. It took 10 seconds. Everyone was on the same page about that. We practiced it ahead of time. So any of the concerns that the coaches brought up from our high school league council, we were able to address in very, very simple ways. So what we actually did with the gender ratios in our league is it's called a 133 gender ratio policy, which Jenna created. Shout out to Jenna. And essentially it talks about matching. So The one is anyone. So anyone is welcome to, it's a spot specifically designated for trans and non-binary folks. They are welcome to go on the field. They are welcome to match up against anyone. We want to give a specific spot for them on the field. And in Ultimate, we have 7 people on the field, just to let you know. And then we had 3 female matching spots. So to match up against a female. And then we had 3 male matching spots. So 3 spots for if you want to match up against a man. And essentially, you know, what we did is we worked through like, okay, we know for a fact that we have trans and non-binary folks in our league. How do we make sure that they're welcoming? And if there are teams that don't, what do we do for that A spot? And it's really nice when you have that one spot because it's anyone. Like anyone can match up against anyone else, but the intention of that spot is to be really inclusive. So it worked really well. I'll talk a little bit about some other practices, but one thing that we did is debrief with our high school league council and then also check in with players and parents and coaches. And everyone really enjoyed the restructuring of this league and are excited to continue learning and growing from this first sort of like pilot program of restructuring our high school mixed league. So one thing that I wanted to share, especially as an organizer of programs, is how I have been trying to frame a lot of how we design our programs, or especially as a coach, how I design my team practices or how I look at my team culture. And then of course, as a player is how am I entering this space? How am I participating in this space? So one thing I constantly ask myself is how might X in whatever decision I'm trying to make impact others? So just taking a step back, not rushing to action, saying, okay, well, let me think about how it may impact others with other experiences that I may not personally have experienced myself. So I think it's one of the best questions I have learned to ask myself in policies and thinking about a broader perspective of how it may or may not impact others. And some other important lessons learned as well is especially with building an inclusive team culture. So if you're part of like a group of kids, or you actually have a club team or a school team, one really important piece is especially around gender inclusive practice is allowing athletes to choose who they want to match up against. I've seen this a lot, especially with elementary school folks. Kids are young, they just like going and playing and running around. So let them decide who they want to match up against, and not forcing kids, oh, you have to match up against this person, you have to match up against that person. Just something that, kids can decide whether they want to get, how challenged they want to be or who they want to match up against. Player development, one of the biggest things I've learned as a coach is, asking your athletes what challenges they face and how you can help as a coach. So I do a lot of one-on-one check-ins with players, whether it's very simple, basic at the beginning of practice. Hey, how are you doing? Like, what challenges are you facing today? And getting just a little perspective, like short perspective, or whether it's a longer, like 30-minute one-on-one. I think one-on-one player engagement is huge and super helpful, especially for youth who are figuring themselves out. The other big piece that we've learned is setting expectations for adults. So being very clear from the get-go what their role is on the sideline and after games, or what their role is as a coach. So a very short tangent, we used to have a lot of parents co-coaching alongside me at games. They really loved coaching their kids. And so one of the things that I do before a big tournament is tell them, I'm the coach, this is how much I've been trained, I'm taking care of your kids. You can be a cheerleader on the sideline, and only positive cheering, yay, hoorays, you did so well, and that's it. And it's been really embraced by our parents in the Bay Area, and it's made a huge difference on the sidelines especially. And of course, the last that I do, we do all of our trainings, I'm a huge fan of this, is anticipating problems. So we know things are going to go wrong. So plan what you're going to do when something does happen. It's really helpful to not have to think problem solving on the fly, and making sure that you have thought about what you may do when something comes up. So we'll put this in the chat for folks' reference, but we're going to do a final breakout session. And when we'll do it, let's do it for 5 minutes. Is in your breakout groups, pick one or more of the problems and just chat about potential solutions. And I've put 3 different examples on here that you can look through. So 1, a player on your team isn't using the correct pronouns of one of their teammates. 2, a parent is unintentionally describing a player using gendered language. And I gave an example in case you weren't sure. And then 3, opponent's coach at halftime tells you it's unfair that you have a trans player on your team. So you can chat through. These may or may not come up. Try and pick one that you'd like to tackle, and we will come back and do our final wrap up.
Okay, great. And you said 5 minutes, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, opening them now.
Unfortunately, with 2 of us, and I ended up taking up a lot with sort of the background, we we unfortunately ended up very short on time today. So there are plenty of hopefully more opportunities for discussion after that. Jen, any closing?
Yeah, just really briefly, since I know y'all are doing a fantastic job sharing in the chat, if there's any solutions or things that I know, put us back in the chat. Back to the breakout rooms. If there's any solutions or things that popped up in your discussions, feel free to throw them in the chat so everyone gets a chance to take a look at them and see if there's any commonalities or new perspectives that they didn't think of. So yeah, just take a minute, add something in the chat of something you talked about in the discussion.
And then Jen, if you want to go to our last slide and share it. Jen and I also have our emails there. If you'd like to contact us further, talk about this further, most of what my brain space is doing, especially during the pandemic when I'm not like working on puzzles all the time like I've been doing, is thinking about trans and non-binary inclusion in sports. So happy to have more of these discussions. Yeah, question 3 of that breakout is definitely a tricky one, and probably one of the more difficult situations to sort of work through in a real life situation if that came up.
Well, thank you so much. I just want to thank Jen and Jenna, Snaps for them, for joining us today and facilitating such a great session. I think we'd all agree that this is an incredibly important topic and one that needs to be centered in all of our work in youth sports. And then second, we want to thank everyone in here for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn. In exactly 2 weeks from today, on September 30th, we'll be joined by Jonas Wirth from the You Can Play project, who will be talking with us about how to create a more inclusive locker room culture. We're going to be continuing to schedule future sessions. We know that there is a lot of great work that's being done across the country, locally. So if you or anyone you know would be interested in sharing your work, your knowledge or experience, please, please, please reach out to us. I'll throw my email in the chat as well. In addition to that, I think to kind of adapt to the virtual world that we're living in, we will keep the Zoom room open for the next 15 minutes to have some informal time, kind of like after a speaker session where you can kind of hang out and meet the people around you. So we'll do that until the bottom of the hour. So once again, Thank you to Jen and Jenna. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. We hope you have a great afternoon.
Nice meeting everyone. You have a good one.
You as well.
Same.
All right, everybody, be safe.
Thank you. Nice meeting everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Jenna and Jen.
I'm curious if anyone is here from a gender specific organization. In our breakout group, we talked about that a bit, but none of us represented one of those. So either Girls on the Run, or someone mentioned they lead a girls empowerment program, and just how policies have adapted, because I know women's colleges have adapted a lot actually. And then there are specific orgs that are specifically changing their missions to say, girls or trans women or LGBT, or basically underrepresented folks, just, it's varying in very specific language. And I'm just curious if anyone here represents, I think, I'm thinking of boys clubs, but also specifically in girls sports, there is an area of advocacy and work in girls sports. But yeah, I just would like to dig into that a little more if anyone here has ideas or thoughts on how those things have been changed or adjusted to represent if someone is transitioning, or if they're allowing someone who's non-binary to even join their programs.
Well, I'm Coach Smith from Lost Boys, and we have both boys and girls, and I am very curious to find out how to build a policy and also how to welcome transgender children and coaches into our organization. I've been trying to do that, so I want to know how to do it properly, because I am the only LGBTQ staff member of the organization, and I've been here with them for over 6 years.
Jenna, do you want me to? I mean,
Who's
so
going to
coming
throw it to you, at
from-
least for the first one?
Okay, yeah. So one of the things that we do at Bay Area Disc is we have, while we have different divisions, so we actually have open, which is open for all, girls with an X, which we define as being inclusive of, cis girls, trans, non-binary, genderqueer folks. And then we have mixed, which was that ratio I was talking about. We actually put in our language and our policies that anyone is welcome to join any division that they would like. So we don't put any parameters or boundaries on of what you can sign up for. It's, if you want to be a part of this, you are welcome to join us. And one of the things that we learned from our Girls with an X, and one of the things that we learned with our girls leadership program is it's great to have inclusive language, but it's also important to follow up with recognizing the unique experiences of trans and non-binary folks. So it's not enough to just say everyone's welcome and then structure your entire program around sort of a very cis focused learning. We look through and go through all of our curriculum. And we have our facilitators trained in, one of our facilitators went to a SOGI workshop, and we actually look through and see, are we making sure that the content and the way that we're structuring our conversations and our discussion are actually being inclusive, or is it just sort of saying everyone's welcome, but then not following up with being welcoming in that space. So those are two examples, but I'm going to shoot it back to Jenna for any other insight.
Thanks, Jen.
I think with any sort of program with trans folks, or trying to be inclusive of trans folks, is just be aware of sort of where they're coming from. So it's sort of just trying to think about how do you make it so that when someone is I want to transition, what does that look like for them? What are the sort of steps that they're taking? What is the process? So if you have a program when there's boys and girls, like how do you make it so that if someone's like, I want to now play with this other team, it's like, cool, let's have that happen. And how do you have it set up with the language and the formatting of the program to make it more inclusive? I think in general, to more like gender specific programs in general, I think using more specific language is better in general, because then you can be specific about who you're trying to include. There's been some conversation in Ultimate about what we mean when we say women and non-binary, sort of a grouping. Do we really mean all non-binary people, or do we mean non-binary as women light? Are often non-binary people who are assigned female at birth. And so thinking about, like, if I have a sports program and I'm trying to be inclusive, like, what does it actually look like in terms of someone is transitioning, now what? Sort of a thought process, which is going to be different for each individual organization, because sometimes it's easier to do that, and sometimes it's more difficult depending on the situation. Don't know if I answered the question at all, but that's sort of some thoughts.
Thank you, Jen. You answered my question, so now I know how to handle this one. My girls want to play with the boys, or I have a landlady who just want to be on the boy team. I know how to handle it now. I just, is it a certain policy that we have to implement or put together for those things, or would it be best to have one in place?
Having a policy of some sort in place before something comes up is generally better. So that even if it's not perfect, there is sort of a, oh, this is happening, here's sort of our initial process. And then if that doesn't work that well, then you can change it for the next time. But at least you have sort of something of like, you know, there's a process, so that especially if someone comes out, they're not just confused as to what's going to happen to them. They have some idea of like, okay, this is going to be the steps. So if I come out in a sport and I'm like, what do I do? There's at least, oh, you know, you can talk to this person. You're welcome to compete on these teams. And we're going to use this different language for these athletes. Jen, any thoughts?
No, policies really help with showing that you are supportive. And also doing that, like, we have a plan in place, so we kind of know next steps. Even as Jenna put, it's not perfect. I think it can be really helpful, just to have something written down that people can reference.
Is there, based on what you just said, is there like a reputable organization that you recommend going to check to make sure your policy is like as inclusive as possible and that it's not missing anything? Because I often get worried when people who are not part of a group make policies for a group, that it isn't as inclusive as we hope it is.
I'm going to do a shout out here to an organization that I've worked with quite a bit in the last 6 months, of Athlete Ally, which focuses on LGBTQ inclusion in sports. And I'm just finishing up a project with them on creating a new trans inclusion policy for NCAA D1 sports. And we thought a lot when we were creating that new NCAA model policy about what we were trying to say to try to be inclusive of trans and non-binary folks. So I would recommend Athlete Ally as an example. Or the other option is look to other sports that may be similar. I know that when I was thinking about what it looked like to be inclusive in Ultimate, I was looking at sports like Quidditch or lacrosse or soccer for some other examples of sports that are similar to Ultimate that might have some examples of ways to be inclusive. Wasn't always successful in looking at different sports, but that's definitely an option depending on what the background is. But yeah, Athlete Ally, if you're like, I need help with LGBTQ inclusion in my sport, Athlete Ally is great.
I had a question, and this was brought up in the chat earlier, actually, about kind of, you know, I obviously, you'll know that I also play Ultimate and have coached Ultimate, but one big thing that we do in Ultimate is like we have sort of the introduction circle, or like that type of thing before a game or whatever. And you know, we don't really do this in the Southeast region, but, you know, traveling west and traveling northwest, having sort of introducing yourself with your pronouns is much more of a common practice. And I think the question in the chat was, is there a potential for making people who are not ready with their pronouns or whatever feel uncomfortable in that situation, and in a space where, or in an intention where we are hoping to actually be inclusive, we're actually doing harm in our impact in that moment?
My general thought with like introduction circles or those types of things is that people, I didn't give this example this time, but that people are allowed to share their pronouns or not if they don't want to. And generally introducing your own pronouns first generally gives people an idea of like, you're welcome to or not in different ways. And it, for me, it quickly becomes clear if people like don't give their pronouns just because they're kind of being dicks about it versus not giving their pronouns because they are uncomfortable with it. For me, in those situations, it's very clear that there are differences between those two experiences. And so leaving it open to share your pronouns if you would like often helps. Or as I think I mentioned in the chat briefly, in youth settings, talking with the athlete or youth in question about, do you feel comfortable with me using this name and pronouns if your parent's going to be on the Zoom call behind you or not, is very helpful. Because maybe they want to use one name and pronoun in practice when they feel more comfortable, and they don't feel as comfortable in a different setting. And talking to the athlete about, okay, where do you feel most comfortable, I think is the best way to go about that. Because you don't want to accidentally out someone to like a parent if you don't have to. So really being connected with the athletes helps a lot.
Thank you. Well, we are at the bottom of the hour now. If anyone has one more question, maybe we can take that.
I feel like as a coach, I'm trying to get in my toolkit of more training of how to implement these policies. I think like similar to like Lee Smith or that was saying, and also just doing that culture work and community building, because I know specifically in the South, and also bringing race into the conversation as well. It's usually I have different kind of struggles bringing that specifically to the Black community, and I know that's something y'all probably can't speak on because y'all not Black, but I'm just trying to see how I can get just get that in my toolkit to like have like maybe facilitation guides to do those community trainings specifically around those sports if y'all have resources to that.
Jay have more direct experience with running trainings for communities, but I'm just gonna plug another Ultimate related organization I've worked with before called Both And. That's some Ultimate folks, but Both And does trainings related to race, both/and that does trainings related to race, gender, and the facilities they have worked in a lot of different places and done trainings on a lot of different topics. So those folks I think would be a good resource if you're looking to try to implement some of these trainings that are both race focused and sports focused.
Word, thank you.
Jen, did you have something to add? Or you look like you were going to add something.
I think the only addition to that amazing resource that Jenna mentioned was we try and structure our programming around specific core values that are inclusive in multiple different facets. So one of our values in our youth programs is belonging. And so we really tie all of our education and training with our coaches and chatting with our players around what does it mean to belong. And so I think it can kind of help, especially younger kids, have a very simple but meaningful understanding of how they enter into a space, how they include others into that space. So we try and put it around like simple value words, but if that's helpful at all.
That is helpful. I feel like, not to keep adding in time, but I feel like when you said something earlier about how when you was in a competitive like ballet space, but you shifted to go in a space that was valued around community, and you name another value. And I was like, that's really important to like ground yourself and like having those values and principles, stepping into a sport to just, and reminding youth of that, instead of being like, oh, this sport is just cool, or like, somebody's push you into it, but really like having these grounding like values and principles, I think are really important, and like really are things that can stick as well. So I appreciate that.
You're welcome. Thanks. Great question.
Well, thank you, everyone. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and thank you, Jen and Jenna, for sticking around and hanging out. Appreciate all the questions, and hope everyone has a great day. See y'all soon.
Thanks.
Thank y'all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye, y'all.
Amazing
Thank you,
facilitation.
everyone.
Bye.